Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for this timely panel. So today we are going to talk about power imbalances and freedom of consent. It's clearly a really wide topic. Luckily, we have some time because we have altogether about 90 minutes. I hope you can make it to be with us until the end. And as Trina said, this session I think it would be good if you can have a look at the organizers of these 3 days sessions, because they all work in a very important field, more and more important nowadays. So today we will talk about collection of personal data, including biometric and ethnicity data, that it's actually becoming really a standard in many contexts, and it comes with risks and harms and many unknowns, I would say. So today we are going to discuss with three speakers. They all belong a bit to the academia part of this story, but if you have time at some point to Google them or check them, each of them have a personal website. You find plenty of things they've been doing or they are doing. And I would say the three of them, they are all a bit at the intersection of different fields. They don't just do one thing. They are these typical hyperactive individuals. So today we will start with just a word about our run-off show. We will have 3 presentations. And as Trina mentioned, you can write your questions in the chat on the left side. And myself and Trina, we will pick up the questions and we will improvise a bit. Some of the questions maybe you want to ask to a specific speaker, or we can just have a conversation all together about these topics. And then at the end, we will have anyway some time for Q&A. So we can start, and I'm giving the floor first to Georgios Glouftsios. He's our first speaker. Georgios is a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Trento in Italy, the School of International Studies. And he's the author of Engineering Digitized Borders, Designing and Managing the Visa Information System. So, Georgios, thank you very much for being with us today, and you have the floor.
Okay, so hello everyone, and thank you very much for being here. Many thanks also to the organizers of this event for their kind invitation. Again, I'm a researcher at the School of International Studies at the University of Trento, where I have an ongoing project funded by Fondazione Caritro that looks at the ways that digital technologies, including biometric technologies, shape the logics and tactics of mobility control in Europe. The main focus of my research is databases used for border security and migration management in the EU member states. The theme of this panel is related to informed consent and the ways that it is often disregarded when vulnerable groups, such as migrants, are concerned. In other words, the question is how to make sure that vulnerable people are properly informed about the ways that their data are being used by stakeholders like police and migration authorities, and that they consent to such use. Well, I think that this is a very important question to ask, and of course, a very important problem to resolve. I'm rather skeptical about the idea that migrants may happily and freely consent in the provision of their data and their processing by state authorities. You see, I may consent to the provision of my biometric data to unlock my smartphone, but when it comes to migrants, the provision of their biometric data may delimit their opportunities to move across Europe, reunite with their loved ones, and build a better future for them and their families. So today, instead of talking about informed consent, I will talk about dissent, as well as the racializing and violent effects of biometric borders. Now, before getting into the details of dissent, race, and violence at the biometric border, let me provide some information about Europe's biometric databases. So we have the Eurodac database, which allows for the registration of fingerprints of applicants for international protection, so basically asylum seekers, and helps to determine which member state is responsible for examining each application. Eurodac also allows for the registration of fingerprints of people apprehended while crossing borders irregularly. Then you have the Visa Information System, or VIS, which enables officials working at the consulates of the EU member states in third countries to create digital files on people applying for short-stay Schengen visas before traveling to the European Union. These files are consulted to understand whether applicants intend to migrate in the member states after the expiry of their visas, to assess the security risks that they may embody, and to check the validity and authenticity of visas at border crossing points. Related to the Visa Information System, the forthcoming entry-exit system will have the technical capacity to calculate the duration of the authorized stay of all third-country nationals in the member states' territories, and to detect those who have no longer the right to stay. And then finally, besides border security and migration management, there are also other biometric databases that are used for law enforcement and the pan-European cooperation in criminal matters, such as the Schengen Information System, or SIS2. The SIS2 contains alerts on individuals convicted of a criminal offense in one or more member states, as well as suspects for whom there are grounds to believe that they have been involved or will be involved in criminal and terrorism-related activities. Now, biometric databases are characterized by a certain kind of corporeal fetishism. Biometrics imply that knowledge of the human body, like fingertip patterns, reveal something about the human self. Biometrics do not only seek to establish the identity of an individual, they also function as passcodes that provide state authorities with access to digital files that contain various administrative information about individuals. So this information can reveal, for example, when and where someone applied for asylum, when and where they applied for a visa, and so on. So data extracted from bodies and their links with such administrative information are synthesized to render individuals controllable subjects. Now, this kind of corporeal fetishism has a long genealogy that can be traced back to the transatlantic slave trade. Simone Brown, in her excellent book Dark Matters, explains how the branding of slaves with hot iron functioned as an early biometric technology. Branding, as Brown explains, was a practice through which enslaved people were signified as commodities to be bought, sold, and traded. The brand, in that context, denoted the relation between the black body and its owner, and slave branding was a racializing act. By making blackness visible as a commodity, branding was a dehumanizing process of classifying people into groups and of producing new racial identities that were tied to a system of exploitation. Now, branding, of course, is very different from contemporary biometric identification technologies used for border and migration management. However, the operational logic is quite similar. Non-European racialized bodies come to be stigmatized. They are translated into digital codes that give them meaning and identity, codes that are used to attach them to specific categories, like that of the irregular migrant and the asylum seekers, codes that are said to reveal their true identity. So migrants are treated as inherently suspect subjects that need to provide additional body evidence to support their claims. And this suspicion is not justified on the basis of their past conduct, but on the basis of their nationality and non-white, non-European background. If you see, for example, the list of countries whose citizens are required to apply for a visa before traveling to the European Union and thus get registered in the visa information system, you will understand that we are talking mainly about people coming from the global south. As part of the visa application process, these people are required to provide body evidence in the form of biometric data, which is registered in pan-European databases used by state authorities to control their mobilities. Now, in the context of migration management, such control of mobilities through biometric databases takes the form of traceability and containment. First, traceability refers to the capacity of state authorities to recreate the journeys and bureaucratic trajectories of migrants through the gathering, processing, and sharing of the digital traces that they leave behind when they encounter the state. For example, when they apply for visas or asylum. A precondition for rendering an individual traceable is their identification, which is done through biometric matching technologies. Second, containment refers to the ways that state authorities slow down, intercept, and redirect migrant mobilities. This is done, for example, through the application of the Dublin regulation, which requires people to apply for asylum in the first country they enter. But many people do not want to remain in the countries that they first entered, such as Greece and Italy. The problem is that once someone is registered as having entered in a country and their fingerprint is captured, they cannot apply for asylum elsewhere. Their fingerprints are registered in Eurodac, and if they apply for asylum in a country other than Greece and Italy, the authorities of that country will identify them through biometric matching, and they will be probably facing deportation. So this leads to a situation where migrants are blocked in Southern Europe, and many of them are living in hotspots that were built precisely in order to ensure effective registration. In fact, during the 2015 migration crisis, it is well documented that Greek and Italian authorities were not registering all arrivals, and so people could move to other European states without the possibility to deport them. The European response to this problem was the so-called hotspot approach. With European funding, hotspots were established in Greece and Italy to increase the registration rates of migrants in Eurodac and therefore enhance their traceability and containment. But migrants are not passive objects of control. They do not consent to control. Many do not want to provide their biometric data precisely because they know that their life chances and capacity to move across Europe depend on their fingerprints. When providing their fingerprints, migrants are rendered traceable and controllable subjects, and they are very much aware of that. In the field that I'm working, so migration and border studies, many scholars describe borders as sites of struggle and contestation. This means that migrants have devised strategies to resist biometric control, and this resistance has taken different forms. The biometric border, in this sense, is characterized by multiple moments of struggle, friction, resistance, and overall dissent. There are many reasons why people may not want to provide fingerprints. Some may want to avoid the risk of being sent back in the member state where they first arrived, such as Greece and Italy. Others may have had bad experience in the past with providing fingerprints in their country of origin. In any case, the important point to stress is that consent is difficult to obtain, and that when consent is obtained, it is often some form of forced consent. Migrants consent in the provision of their biometrics because they cannot do otherwise. There are several examples of practice of dissent and resistance at biometric borders. This can include, for example, protests. For instance, back in 2015, a group of 200 Eritrean migrants protested in Lampedusa while shouting, "We are human beings, no fingerprints, we want freedom." Some of them have also begun hunger strikes. Another example of dissent is the practice of burning or mutilating fingertips. Asylum seekers are cutting or burning their fingers to prevent identification by state authorities. This practice made the news for the first time in Sweden back in 2004, when an 18-year-old asylum seeker described in a Swedish radio station that they had burned their fingers after applying for asylum in Italy. As he said, "I turned on the stove and waited until the burners were hot. Then I placed all 10 fingers on them. When my hands were burned, I took them off and put oil on them. Then I put my hands back on the burners and burned them again." What I want to emphasize here is that besides denoting dissent towards biometric control, the practice of burning fingertips is a certain kind of liberating act through self-directed violence. Self-directed violence is here a way to escape control and a mode of self-determination. Violence to oneself is a mode of escaping forms of legitimated state violence, including prolonged detention, deportation, and coercive fingerprinting. But the violence of the biometric border is not only linked to acts of dissent, it is also related to the forced biometric registration of migrants in databases like Eurodac. Back in 2014, and in response to low fingerprint registration rates in Greece and Italy, the European Commission published a set of best practices for upholding states' obligation to take fingerprints in the context of Eurodac. While most of these guidelines were about modes of counseling to persuade migrants to provide fingerprints voluntarily, it is striking that the document specifies that if initial counseling fails, coercion for the provision of fingerprints would be justified. The document specified also that in cases where asylum seekers have damaged their fingers or otherwise made it impossible to capture fingerprints by using glue, for example, they have to be kept in detention until their fingers heal and it becomes possible to capture fingerprints again. In practice, such guidelines have been translated, at least in some cases, into direct physical violence, as well as threats of violence. Indeed, a report published by Amnesty International back in 2016 revealed cases.
I am afraid we lost the connection to Georgios.
Yes, I think he will be right back. Okay, waiting for Georgios to come back, I would just wanted to remind you that you can ask questions or put inputs in the common chat. You see it on the left, it's called public chat. There could be questions for Georgios, or also could be, generally speaking, issues that you think we might want to discuss today in this panel, because we have some time today. So also I think could be interesting, because I mean, some of us today, we are maybe journalists or investigative journalists, and today we have 3 academics. Oh, Georgios is coming back. Maybe.
Hello?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes. I'm sorry, it was a technical problem. I think I was, I'm really sorry about that. My internet
No worries,
connection
no worries. Glitches happen.
is-
Okay, you can continue when you're ready.
I can just repeat that most of the technical problems can be solved by refreshing the browser window. That goes for speakers as well. Probably what you did, Georgios.
Yeah. Okay, now I cannot share my screen, but I will continue from where I was left. So I think the video stopped when I was talking about the report of Amnesty International, right? Okay, so
just a second, because we see your slides. We see the slide coercion, violence, and fingerprinting.
Okay, but okay, fair enough, but I cannot control it. Anyway, this is the last slide, so no problem.
Okay.
Okay, so in practice, as I said, the guidelines by the European Commission have been translated into physical violence as well as threats of violence. And according to a report published by Amnesty International, there were several cases of migrants that have been beaten and hit with some kind of electric shock button. And the report also presented stories of migrants who experienced sexual harassment, as well as stories of people who have witnessed violence and decided to consent to fingerprinting. Okay, so to conclude, so what does this all mean for informed consent, right? Is it even possible to acquire informed consent in the context of biometric borders? So my answer to this question is that it depends. The main focus of this very brief presentation was the biometric registration of asylum applicants and irregular migrants in EU databases. In this context, I think that informed consent is difficult, if not impossible, to acquire. However, there are other categories of mobile subjects, specifically those privileged ones, who may consent happily to the provision of their data for the facilitation of their travels. Academics, other people who travel very often, and so on. This can happen, for example, by enrolling in diverse trusted traveler schemes and enjoy accelerated mobility in airports. But in this case, we talk about a completely different category of individuals. Biometrics in this context exemplify privilege and discrimination as regards unequal mobilities. We are all in one way or another mobile, and we are all in one way or another providing our data in order to travel. However, for some people, providing data is a trap that prevents them from moving, a trap that confines them in countries where they may not want to stay, and a trap that renders them traceable and controllable. And in those cases, I feel that we are talking about dissent and struggle at the border rather than informed and free consent. And I will leave it here.
Thank you. That was very interesting and very sad, or like concerning. We have a couple of questions, but I would say maybe the first one we will take it later, because we will have our third speaker joining us, and this more into law and regulation. So we will dive into that a bit later. Carolina is asking us, this is horrible, and I wish we could discuss more how to shift the responsibility on this. And the basic question is, what can we do? So I believe this, we will discuss about it maybe later all together. But one question maybe stemming from Carolina's question maybe, Georgios, how do you do your research work in this field? Because this, for us as journalists, I think is also very important to know, because these are really very strong stories. But how can you give us a tip? How do you do this?
So what I do is basically field work. So I go interview people about their experience with fingerprinting, but I also rely very much on reports published online and stories by you, basically by investigative journalists. And I think that your work as investigative journalists, but also the work of NGOs like Amnesty International, is very useful for us as academics. Because we learn from your stories, and we actually translate your stories into, let's say, more conceptual and more academic stuff. But of course, I do also my own research. As I said, like the main way to find information about these topics is basically to find the people who experience some sort of discrimination in terms of biometric controls. So the only way, at least in my point of view, is to do field work, to go out in the field and talk to people. And of course, combine this with different kinds of reports, news stories, official documents published by the Commission, and so on.
Yeah, that's very interesting, because in a way this opens also a field where academia and investigative journalists can work together, which I think is something that can be just beneficial for both parties, maybe. In terms of field work, it's also very interesting. I think it rings a bell, because for investigative journalists, that is like the old-fashioned way to go after a story. And of course, there are different ways of doing it. So I think really we will discuss this also later on. How can we maybe work together? Thank you so much. And now I will give the floor to Stefania. Stefania is also hyperactive. I will put in the chat her personal website in a minute. She's Associate Professor of New Media and Digital Culture at the University of Amsterdam. And she's the principal investigator of Data Active project, which explores how movements and citizens use data and data analysis techniques as the craft of getting stories out of numbers to provoke social change and resist surveillance, which I think is great. And she's also co-investigator and a participant to many more projects. I will put in the chat her personal website. She's, in a nutshell, obviously very passionate about the interplay between technologies and societies. And this has a lot to do also with politics, of course. So, Stefania, you have the floor. And please keep everyone sending questions and inputs in the public chat. Thank you. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Serena, Trine, and Georgios, for what I've heard so far, but also, of course, for the luxury of being here with you today. I already knew a lot of the stories that Georgios was talking about, but of course, seeing, for example, hearing the direct quotes makes things much more real, and of course, as some have pointed out in the chat, much more dramatic in their realism. So so first of all, I would like to start with two disclaimers. I'm not feeling very well, so if I do strange faces or something, if I have to sneeze, all of a sudden, you know why. But also, down my house here in Amsterdam, besides this big storm, but there is also, it's already noisy in itself. They are also doing some unexpected road works. So they were quiet so far. Now they seem to have restarted, but far enough from the microphone. But I hope it's not going to bother you too much, but that's also a part of life. So I'm very happy to speak to you today, not only because, of course, the topic, the general topic of data dilemmas and how to investigate them, and even more so the issue of power imbalances and the right to consent are very close to my work and my heart as well, but also because I'm a proud member of the UK National Union of Journalists. Although I'm no longer really a practicing journalist because academia has taken a lot of my time, I still pride myself for having started there, and I still retain the passion for storytelling and news making, and I have a lot of respect for the work of journalists, especially, of course, investigative journalists. I was one of them in the past. And it also happened to me, unfortunately, to lose sources when, for example, writing on various forms of dissidence in certain parts of the world. So the issue of visibility, the issue of consent, the issue of protecting sources, but also affording rights to the people we talk to is something that I have unfortunately had very sad experiences with, and that therefore I consider it particularly important. So my story has also something to do with migrants, but not necessarily. Definitely, I don't look at migrant communities closely as the previous speakers does, but I do look at vulnerable communities. And I would like to start sharing what I would like to share with you today from two observations that have become even more urgent, if you want, over the last year and a half, 2 years, since the inception of the COVID-19 pandemic. The first has to do with the broad realm of digital rights. When we focus on digital rights, and human rights as they apply to the new big data, artificial intelligence, biometrics era, or the digital age, if you want, we tend, as a Western individual, or with European values, let's say, we tend to privilege issues of privacy and data protection. Now, don't get me wrong; these are, of course, very serious concerns, and they do deserve all of our attention. At the same time, what became clear in my research as well is that while focusing on data protection and privacy is particularly important and certainly dutiful, for some communities and some individuals, privacy is in fact a luxury. And more on this in a minute. The second observation that I would like to start from is that the pandemic has made clear how important questions of power, of data power and power imbalances when it comes to data production are. Just to give you a sense, I'm sure you're aware of that, but I want to repeat this, which is, I think, something that we tend to forget also as journalists. When reporting on the COVID pandemic, of course, it started in China, then it hit Italy, then it hit pretty much anywhere very close to home, which means that, of course, we privilege a domestic, sometimes even local perspective when reporting. But this, for example, when it comes to connect to the migrant story, when it comes to missing data, it results into misrepresentation of partial stories. I'll give you an example. At the inception of the COVID-19 pandemic, only 2 out of a total of 54 African countries had the ability to identify, so to test for the presence of the COVID-19 virus. This meant that Africa, for the first months of the pandemic, was a big black hole, right? A big blind spot. But not only that, going back to the story of migrants in Italy tend not, I'm Italian of origin, so allow me to use that example, but they tend not to report to hospitals, also for lack of information, because medical doctors are not supposed to report on them, but they are often invisible to society and also invisible to the health care system. What does it mean in practice? If infected, and that was often the case because they were living in cramped quarters, they would not be tested. They would not look for help, hence they would not show up in the official COVID counting. Next step in this very sad story was then the emergence of racialized narratives, actually racist narratives, about how people of African descent are immune to the virus. So not only do they come to steal our jobs and wives, but they also, are not affected by this problem that affect us all. Now we know very well this is sadly not true. Africa, in the meantime, also thanks to the help of the World Health Organization, has managed, to expand massively its testing capacity, although the vaccinations are not readily available over there. But what I want to say, using the example of Africa and the example of migrants, undocumented migrants within Fortress Europe, is that data are also part of the history of power, for example, in the pandemic. Now, the pandemic is just an example that made things more apparent, even more dramatic. And migrants are only one of the communities that are affected. Think of survivors of domestic violence, for example, and many other communities, including gig workers that might not show up at first in the official counting. The second observation leads me to my next point, which is a point of the fact that what the pandemic has made clear is that we have a problem of data poverty. So not only of data imbalance, but also data poverty. And I'm going to tell you in a minute what that is, but I would like to now just pitch something. This is a book which is open access in 5 languages. It's how do you say, like a sort of instant book almost. It's called COVID-19 from the Margins. I have to read the title because I don't even remember. Pandemic Invisibilities, Policies and Resistance in Datafied Society. I'm not showing it to you so that you can buy it. It's distributed for free. And if you reach out to me, you can not only have your free copy, I can put later the URL to download your free copy in digital format, but you can also have a paper copy if you, like me, prefer something tangible. This book is a collection of stories it comes from a blog called COVID-19 from the Margins, a multilingual blog where we try to tell stories of communities at the margins as they battled the Corona-19 emergency. And as I said, this in many languages because, as often it's a case, English might be the lingua franca, but we miss a lot when we only speak in English, and we miss a lot of voices that are not particularly skilled, maybe, or used to speak in English. But so one of the arguments that we advance in the book is that there is something that, in a situation in which quantification becomes more and more important, numbers, data become the central part of our narratives. Think about the pandemic again, but you can really generalize this story to many other phenomena that we often report about. Data poverty is a growing concern. What is data poverty? Data poverty has to do with condition of invisibility that is particularly dramatic, invisibility in data sets, in databases, which is particularly dramatic when numbers determine the existence of a problem and our ability to identify the problem and care for the problem or the affected community. Now, as I mentioned at the start of my presentation, privacy for some communities is a luxury. Think, for example, about what is happening in India, where there is the biggest biometric identity system. So where people identify not only through, let's say, the traditional ID card, which might or not contain biometrical data, increasingly, unfortunately, does, but also through their fingerprints. And this meant, for example, again, in the pandemic, there's something about that in the book written by my colleague, Side Masiero, who does research in India. This means that, for example, if you're an impoverished family and you want to feed your children, you can have access to food subsidy program of the government, but for that you have to give up your biometric data. Now the problem is that for the terror of the fears of spreading the virus further, the biometric system was not in use at the beginning of the pandemic for a while, so which resulted literally in people starving because they couldn't be identified, therefore they couldn't get access to food subsidies. But so for an impoverished Indian citizen, we may say, well, privacy is actually a luxury if you need these food subsidies. So this is what me and myself and my colleague Emiliano Trede from Cardiff University have identified as the problem of the growing data poor. So it's a form of invisibility in the datafied society that we often tend to forget in a way when we privilege, as Western privileged individuals, issues of privacy and data protections. Now, to get to the topic of today, the freedom of consent. I would like to start briefly from the GDPR. Now, the next speaker is much more skilled than I am to talk about this, and you're going to hear a lot about that already. But I would just like to tell you what we have done in the context of the Data Active project. Now, the Data Active project, by the way, my website is not really up to date. The Data Active project has expired, has ended at the end of August, although we are still writing up a lot of stuff and looking into the data and continuing the work that we have done. But we have to distinguish, of course, between the timeline of a 5-year research project and the timeline of journalism or investigative journalism. Maybe investigative journalism is a bit more flexible. Journalism is not particularly so. But I would still like to offer, some hints of what we did when we're battling with issues of consent. So if you look at the GDPR text, we're going to hear more of that in a minute. Vulnerable people are defined as those who are not legally competent, or they are legally incompetent to give their consent to the use of data. Typically, think about minors, for example, and there's other categories, but minors is the first that comes to mind. But the GDPR also mentions something interesting, which represents a step forward from the previous legislation from '96 on data protection, which is that vulnerable people can be also those who might suffer from the adverse consequences if their personal data were to become public. And starting from that, although we started working on the Data Active project long before the GDPR was law, but we were already trying to follow this principle in a way. So expanding the category of vulnerable population. So for us, vulnerable population in our research was not only the people that are vulnerable because they are minors or because maybe they have some mental disability, but they were all those whose work would potentially expose them to threats of various kinds, or even those people that might not be vulnerable today, but might become in the future. I'll give you an example. We used to work a lot with developers and trainers in digital security, including, for example, encryption. Now, encryption, it's legal in most countries, but not everywhere. But also, it was news of the Cameron government in the UK, for example, that they wanted to. It was just mentioned. Luckily, no further action was taken, but that they wanted to outlaw encryption, communication encryption, interpersonal communication encryption. But also, there was a case where Turkey jailed a number of trainers in digital security precisely because they were supporting human rights defenders in the country, providing them with this key knowledge how to encrypt their communication. So what I want to say is that we also have to reason with time here and not assume that what is legal today might be legal or accepted also as a social norm, not necessarily as in streaming legislation tomorrow. So what did we do? So we first, because my time is coming to an end, we expanded the category of vulnerable population to everyone whose activities, in the case, for example, of activism and human rights related activities in determined countries, would potentially expose them to threats. Second, we try to treat them not as data sources to extract data from, but as skilled learners. So people who, in fact, know much more than we do, investigators or journalists, of a given practice. And this also changes the relation that you enter into when you change your terminology from data source to skilled learner. It's a cosmetic thing, if you want, but it hides a much bigger conceptual operation. And then, to conclude, we used the consent form that we were supposed to collect as a conversation starter to identify vulnerabilities and also to make people feel at ease with what they were getting into. And, because sometimes we also collect the consent in alternative ways, but that's another story that maybe I can leave for next time. But essentially, changing the relation to our sources in a sort of conceptual manner, then also has practical implications that I think are beneficial to the relation and can also speak to the problem of power imbalances in data protection. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
So thank you so much. Just maybe a couple of notes, because I mean, you mentioned the encryption tools, and I think this is, again, rings a bell for investigative journalists, because we are aware that in several countries, actually, even just crossing the border and you have on your phone, say, Signal, that could be already a red flag. So I think there it's again a field, going also back a bit to one question that we have in the chat, and we will go to this later on, is that, I mean, it's not just all these issues, it's not just, it's about them. Because we are, like every one of us, we are obviously privileged, white, and belonging to a certain part of the world and the society. But all these issues have really wide implications. And I think investigative journalists are quite in the front line with that. And maybe just another little note. Okay, if you can maybe put in the chat some updated links where we can have a look at this project, because I've seen that one link is in fact offline. And then you mentioned actually data poverty, which I find is a very interesting point. I would also maybe, as you went a bit into the COVID issue, I would maybe also mention the data mess, which for me as an investigative journalist specializing in this field has been very striking in this couple of years. That is, at times we might have also data, quite a lot of data, but it's very chaotic. And this is another way perhaps to make it in a way more difficult to analyze, because with chaos you can't really start anything meaningful. And anyways, we are going to now continue with Gianclaudio Malgieri. Gianclaudio Malgieri will help us, first of all, going into the definition of vulnerable. Gianclaudio is a professor of law and technology in Brussels. And he has also reached personal website where you can find more about his work, current, ongoing, old projects. There is quite a lot there too. He has been working especially on exploring how the data protection law and consumer law can mitigate data subjects' vulnerabilities. So we are very much in this topic today, but also how to regulate artificial intelligence, data ownership, protection, manipulation. So I think it's very interesting for us as journalists, probably, also to really see that from these three speakers today, we might have in the future interesting collaborations, or we can ask you guys interesting questions. So Gianclaudio, I leave you the floor.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me well?
Yeah, you have a little echo, but it's fine. Yeah, thank you.
I have headset. I hope. Otherwise, I can. You tell me. So first of all, thank you very much, Serena. I'm very happy, honored to be with you all, and I am, excited that someone can pronounce my name and surname well. Italians. Okay, great. Then apologies for being late. I was teaching. You already know. I'm very sorry, in particular with Georgios, because I was extremely interested in his presentation. I hope I will take the recording soon. So going into the topic of today, I must confess that I feel amazed by the fact that more and more panels are addressing this topic, finding finally some fellows on this topic. I mean, there are, we discussed this topic, but more and more attention is great, because it was like Cinderella, at least in data protection law, it was a real Cinderella topic, right? Okay. I would like to how to say, I am triggered by the data poverty provocations, and I want to collect them, but first I will do like the job you asked me, so a rapid focus on the GDPR approach to vulnerability, which could be better, the GDPR approach to vulnerability, but lawyers love to take under the surface, so we try to draw a fil rouge. I will be rapid, because I mean I wrote my PhD on this, so I should really self-restrain, otherwise we are going to talk a lot. So you need definitions. It's difficult to find definitions. I propose you a definition. A vulnerable data subject we can agree that is a data subject with higher risk of harms for their fundamental rights and freedoms. This is quite neutral definition. It can mean many things. In the GDPR, we have just a recital, which is 75, referring to the data protection impact assessment risks, to the high risk data processing, and they mention vulnerable data subject. As Stefania was saying, just children are mentioned explicitly. But then the European Data Protection Board, in the working party opinion about risk and high risk data processing, they mention among vulnerable people, they mention employees, asylum seekers, elderly, and people with cognitive disabilities. Just to make some, I can put the link in the chat later. But let's focus on actually the bigger picture. So the GDPR is not just the risk. Of course, we agree that a vulnerable data subject is someone with higher risk, and we know that GDPR is risk-based approach. But there are at least two perspectives to consider, in my view. One is to be vulnerable within the data processing. Another is to be vulnerable to the effects of the data processing. I think if we make this distinction clear, it's easy to find solutions and safeguards. People that are vulnerable within the data processing are people suffering from data illiteracy, people with limited cognitive capabilities, so people that cannot read privacy policy, that cannot decide if they can give consent, people that cannot exercise their data protection rights. Children, elderly people suffering from digital divide, people speaking other languages, all this kind, but also workers. Why workers? Because in my view, it's not just data illiteracy, it's also the inability or the incapability of saying no. So when there is a strong imbalance in the provision of consent, we are in a situation of, let's say, vulnerability within the data processing. So vulnerability related to my data. Then there is another kind of vulnerability that is also, in my view, under the scope of the GDPR, which is vulnerability to the effects of data processing. So vulnerability to discrimination, vulnerability to manipulation, vulnerability to stigmatization, harmful content, limitation to freedom of speech, freedom of movement, etc. These people can well understand the data protection policy, can well give or deny their consent, can exercise their rights, but anyway, they might suffer from discriminatory bias in AI, from manipulative bias on AI on Facebook, or all this kind of stuff. If we keep these two things separate, maybe it's a bit easier to imagine. I mean, first of all, to look at the GDPR as a bigger box, but also to look at some solutions. I will come to the solution in a moment. One thing that I think might be interesting, vulnerability is an ambiguous concept, and it's there is a high risk of stigmatization. If people are old, immigrants, LGBTQ, and also you put the label of vulnerable, they might feel also stigmatized. There is wonderful studies in gender studies and feminist studies about how vulnerability is a harmful concept. This was the first era. Then so we have two views. One is particularist vulnerability. So just some people are vulnerable, but this has been accused of being stigmatizing those people. So the feminist studies replied in a way that we are all vulnerable, like Judith Butler, etc. They say vulnerability is intrinsic in humanity. But if we take this approach, how to protect the more vulnerable, right? So I think that a good solution was proposed by, for example, Florencia Luna. She's a bioethicist in Argentina. She said we should propose a layered approach of vulnerability. We are all a bit vulnerable, but there are more layers of vulnerability. Let's focus for 1 second on the GDPR, on data processing. It's different layers and factors of vulnerability. The first are my characteristics: being an immigrant, being gay, being non-binary, etc. is of course of being of a disadvantaged social or economic condition. Being a migrant is of course a personal characteristic. Then there is another factor to consider, which is, in my view, the power and potentialities of the data controller. In comparison with Facebook, we are all vulnerable because Facebook can easily manipulate us through our cognitive biases, for example. The German Bundeskartell court last year said that Facebook is a monopolist and all people don't feel free to give consent. I mean, feel free to say yes to any condition that Facebook imposes. It means that there is a vulnerability within the data processing. So the first category of vulnerability as regards big techs like Facebook and Google is the lock-in, right? And this is something we should also consider. And then there is a third factor that we could consider, which is vulnerability mechanisms or vulnerability drivers. So what actually Google or Facebook do, the encounter between the Facebook potentialities, Facebook power concentration, and my personal characteristics, what are the vulnerable drivers that are used? Manipulative advertisement, bias, cognitive bias, etc. Okay, so now that very rapidly I try to explain you a bit how we can see vulnerable people in data protection. There are different things to consider. So just getting the point on data poverty and data protection as a privilege, right? In addition to more basic rights that many people are deprived from, right? I think we could mention this as a double privacy paradox. We know the privacy paradox, right? The privacy paradox is the fact that usually people say that they care about their data, but after, for very few counter performances, rewards, access to a service or whatever, they give away their data, right? I do it with my student. I ask them, would you sell your data? And they all, I use WooClap, it's like an interactive way. And they all say, no, I wouldn't sell my data for anything. And then I say, what if for a free pizza, would you give your data? And they say, oh yes, of course, a pizza. So the point is, and a French pizza, you can imagine. So the point is, there is privacy paradox. For vulnerable people is even worse, because vulnerable people hire more their data, but as Stefania was saying, have higher need to give their data, because sick people need that their data are processed by hospitals, need that their data are processed during COVID-19 triage algorithms or whatever, right? Poor people need that their data are into the algorithms to access to social welfare and social benefits, right? But at the same time, the risk of discrimination, the risk of manipulation for these people is higher. So you see that for them is their higher value of data, but at the same time, the higher need to share, right, data. This is, in my view, a double paradox that can be solved if we look at the two different kinds of vulnerability. So if the vulnerability is data illiteracy, the fact that I cannot understand, I am not free to say no, because you are my boss, or you are the public administration, or you are Facebook, and I feel to be locked in. Well, the solution, and the topic of today was consent, so I'm happy to talk about this a bit. The solution might be to go away from traditional consent. Let's look at new forms. There is, for example, the clinical trials regulation example, in which consent of incapacitated people is getting a non-conventional way. I try to understand through a psychologist or through a mediator or through someone else, what is your real intention? I ask consent during time, like dynamic consent, right? I changed my, and I explain you more and more. I explain you not just with a written policy, I explain you with voice, etc. Or another thing is to avoid consent as a legal basis in data protection. And we take legitimate interest, for example, or public interest. And you might say, oh, but this is outrageous. You are limiting the agency of these people. No, because you still have to do an accountability balancing test as a data controller. You have to balance your interest with the data subject interest. You have to care about them, right? And usually consent is seen as a passe-partout. I take consent and I am free. No, you still have to do a balancing test, a data protection impact assessment, right? So I will conclude with this creative solution that was proposed by the EDPS, a preliminary opinion on scientific research and data protection in 2019. I was in panel fit and we were working with consent in that period, etc. There was a real clash between the European Commission research executive agencies saying we should use consent for research. And then we had the EDPS saying, no, consent is weak, people don't read, people just give out their consent, and data controllers feel like deresponsibilized, like really passepartout, yeah, consent is okay, we open all the door. The preliminary opinion proposed a mediation, said, don't use consent as a first legal basis, but make sure that you understand the real privacy expectation of people and ask consent as a safeguard. So just to understand what's their view. I know this is a bit acrobatics and a bit strange for lawyers to have this, but still this is something that we should focus on. What we want to know through consent, we want to know what is the expectation of the subject, right? And we have several ways to get this expectation. Some ways are more paternalistic, other are more, let's say, libertarian, but in any way, consent as it is today is not well equipped for that. So for vulnerable people, I think we should find alternative ways, and we should focus on all possible ways. And also data protection rights should be made more easily enforceable by them. Every time that the GDPR talks about children, I think by analogy, we should consider other people that suffer similar vulnerabilities of children, like people with limited cognitive capabilities or more easily manipulatable, etc. Sorry if I got too much time. I hope I didn't.
No, it's perfect. Thanks a lot. So I will maybe just ask a couple of questions. So first of all, because of course, COVID-19 is popping up, right? I mean, it's clear because we are all in this situation since almost 2 years. But in fact, I wanted to throw something in this arena because you all mentioned somehow. But for instance, Gianclaudio, you just talked about the incentive. What if I promise you a pizza if you do something? So as a medical investigative journalist, I've been working recently for the British Medical Journal about vaccine incentives, okay? And we are a bit in this field where you have negative incentives, positive incentives, which are quite funny, like I give you a beer if you get a jab, quite interesting, but also the negative incentives. And in the biomedical literature, we see also in a way as a negative incentive, the COVID pass, right? Or the green pass. I wanted to ask you guys, all the three of you, if some of you have some insight to share with us, because the green pass or COVID pass comes with a QR code. So we are talking about data. And there is a level of consent that you have to, of course, give. But where are we with that? I don't know if Gianclaudio or Stefania have something to say about this. And then we can move on. We have some interesting questions in the chat.
Maybe Stefania go first because...
Okay, so my non-legal perspective, I'm a sociologist, so, passionate about law, but definitely I'm not Gianclaudio in that respect. I am concerned about the vaccination certificates. I'm a big fan of vaccinations. I got it immediately as soon as I could. Don't get me wrong. But I am concerned by the potential inequality effects of a vaccination passport in a digital format. We even wrote about that together with some colleagues. I'm going to then also open access little story. They're commentary, so they're easy to read, very quick, but where we actually say that the vaccination certificate equals, or resembles a sort of performance and performativity theater because it overpromises, but also because of its spillovers in terms of inequality. If we look at the QR code, my personal perspective, I have it printed, but I don't have the app on my phone. That's my own personal perspective and preference. Of course, it exists. I mean, in the moment in which my printed version is read by an app, I mean, we're back to square one, right? But maybe it's my own, ways of making sense of my own fears. But to talk about the inequality spillover, we refer in particular to moments in which, and it was the news in the UK not long ago. That essentially now it's so what I want to say is that with vaccinations not being equally accessible to everyone across the world, we're talking about the global south in particular, then the vaccination passport becomes yet another layer of discrimination when, for example, it is about entering Western countries. So these are our fears. But in the article we say a little more, and I leave it to Gianclaudio with a much more informed perspective, I'm sure.
Stefania, can you please put in the chat the link to this article you just mentioned? Thank you. Gianclaudio.
Yeah, I've not a much more informed response. I think Stefania's response was great. Of course, it's a very slippery slope. So, this is a real hot topic. So maybe there is a academic self and the personal self. The personal self is a fan of green passport because it helps my daily life from France, Italy, and Belgium to travel. I don't have to do like depistage or like test every time I travel. My let's say more intellectual self, I see that in general incentivation and negative ones, so positive and negative ones, is problematic in any field. In the clinical trials regulation, it's explicitly written that you cannot pay someone for doing clinical trial, but you can reimburse. It creates a problem for people of more disadvantaged economic conditions, because of course a wealthy person wouldn't accept to be like a research subject for the most crazy projects, right? But there are people in Africa that accept to be tested under very many different innovative drugs and even cosmetics, just in exchange of money, right? And I think we need to protect this kind of thing. There is the risk of course, there is a risk of paternalism in this, because you say you cannot decide freely what to do with your body. But I think that in the European Union, we have the principle of dignity that is a bit, helping with this. The principle of dignity, no one knows actually what it is. It's like Matryoshka doll. You open and you find more dolls, but in the end, the last one is empty. But I think we could really reflect upon this. So yeah, and I think it's all right. We go on with more other questions. Yeah.
So if I might say, maybe I found interesting the way you just spoke, because I mean, of course, we all have more than one identities, right? I mean, we have a personal opinion, we have the academic, the investigative journalist, whatever. We have many hats all the time. But I find quite fascinating what you mentioned, because you mentioned in terms of the vaccination passport, that is giving you freedom of mobility. So in a way, you are really going to that point, right? That it gives you this. And I also wanted to pinpoint also what Stefania said, that I find as a medical reporter quite funny that nowadays we are all need to say, I'm not against vaccines, right? Before we can speak up our opinion. I find it quite worrying, I have to say, also because I am from this field. However, we have some questions from the chat. Georgios, do you want to say something on this topic?
Not really, because I prefer to leave this to Stefania and Gianclaudio. They are the experts on this topic. I'm not, and we have this tendency lately that we all have an opinion about COVID, and I don't want to pretend to be a person who has an opinion about COVID. The only thing that I would say is like to second what Stefania said about potential discrimination, and especially as regards people coming from the global south who do not have access to vaccines, and so they do not hold a vaccine passport. But yeah, that's all. I don't think that I have something else meaningful to say on that.
So I'm going to put now in the chat, just for everyone, there was an interesting paper recently published, just to close this COVID chapter. It's called The COVID Excuse, How European Border Violence in the Mediterranean Sea is actually apparently, yeah, COVID-19 restrictions, of course, play a role also there. Because, I mean, there is also probably an invisibility, right? Became even more invisible than what it was already. I'll put it in the chat. Now, I would like to ask Gianclaudio, because you were not there, but we had a question when you were still teaching. Marius was asking, how is interfering our security and counter-terrorism measures with the migration rights? It's a bit of a wide question, I would say, but I think Marius was trying a bit to put together what we heard from Georgios, because he was talking about what happens at the borders, right? When there is this data collection that is enforced, I mean, you can't call it consent, comes also with violence. So he was a bit going into the rights field. So I was wondering if you can help us address this question. You are muted.
Yeah. So the question was, if I understand correctly, if anti-terrorism fight is limiting freedom of migrants and okay, yeah. I mean, I think this is more like a legal political question than a legal question, because of course we know that the Patriot Act in the US after the Twin Towers attack became one of the biggest form of intrusion of privacy, of legalized form of privacy intrusion in the US under the Bush administration, etc. So of course this is a great slippery slope. We know that. We know that for emergency, under the emergency label, we can have a real passport for limiting rights of individuals. I am, as you know, a GDPR enthusiastic person, so I would refer to the GDPR as a model for a good balancing of rights and emergency, let's say, interest. You have many specifications on how emergency situations like public health, etc., can be balanced out individual rights. So individual rights can be limited, but the GDPR says not to the essence of the right? To the essence of data protection. This is not just GDPR, this is the European Convention on Human Rights, this is Article 8 of the European Charter of Fundamental Rights. So all this. So I think it's good, and I think it's fascinating that even, I mean, the GDPR was approved in 2016, and it was, in my view, already ready to deal with COVID crisis because it had already things. But I don't want to speak always about data protection. In general, I think that, of course, we need to balance these things out, and it's very, very dangerous. I think that democratic states are the states in which there is a good control on that. So just to mention, if there is a secret surveillance by let's say secret services, there should be a strong non-political control on them, right? And many countries don't have. There should be a different oversight body, one for example, police, and another one for secret service. It's okay to have it separate, but it should be totally independent. Many countries in Europe don't, and the European Court of Strasbourg, the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg many times said that many countries, with the excuse of fighting crime, were limiting rights because there was no oversight body that could block secret service activity. So just this.
Yeah, thank you. So we have another question that was there from Constantina. She was actually asking Georgios, but I think each of our speakers might have something to say about this. Do you think that the biometric surveillance developed and used in migrants without consent can be used now in European Union citizens without them knowing? Have you noticed it happening in other ways, like the CCTV cameras in the UK? Or do you have example? And then one more question. Also, do you know in which ways artificial intelligence is abusing available citizen data today? So again, is a very wide question. Maybe we can break it down. So maybe we could go first about what's happening to them. It's actually happening to us as well, to which extent. Who of you want to say something? Georgios, I see you moving. Maybe you want to say something.
Yes. So first of all, I would like to emphasize that we are talking about a completely different category of people. And this relates also to what Gianclaudio said earlier. Sometimes we represent ourselves, but also, citizens as vulnerable. We are all vulnerable. However, when it comes to migration, we are talking about another level of vulnerability. So, of course, it is true that sometimes technologies that are tested in the field of migration management come to be implemented in our cities, such as CCTV cameras, facial recognition technologies, so on. However, I think that we need to differentiate those two things instead of trying to compare them. So when we talk about the biometric registration of migrants, we talk about a completely different phenomenon than the biometric identification of citizens in everyday spaces, like public spaces and cities. And this is precisely because, I take the example of myself, right? I'm a white European. I will not be discriminated to the same extent as a migrant or a person of color and so on. So I don't like, because sometimes people say that, well, you have massive collection of data about everyone. Yes, but not everyone's data matter the same. And it is different to say that, you have data collection about European citizens, and something completely different to say that I'm collecting the biometric data of migrants in order to confine them in spaces that are unlivable, such as hotspots and so on, or to confine them in countries that in which they do not want to stay because they cannot find a job, because they do not have any family ties, and so on. And this also relates also to the previous question about migration and counter-terrorism. So we see increasingly that migrants are being targeted for law enforcement purposes. So, for instance, Eurodac, the system that I talked about, was initially developed with one purpose, and this one purpose was the implementation of the Dublin regulation. However, we see now that law enforcement access is provided to the system, so police authorities can access the system for law enforcement purposes. And this is against, and Gianclaudio probably knows much better about this than me, this is against the purpose limitation principle. So while you have instruments that are traditionally used for migration management, this is their purpose, increasingly they are accessed by police authorities and other agencies, and so their purpose somehow transforms. We're talking about law enforcement and counter-terrorism rather than simply migration management. So migrants are treated as suspect subjects. Their data are being consulted by police and other intelligence agencies, and this is highly problematic. And this is completely different from the collection of data for EU citizens, for instance.
Stefania, you want to say something, or we go to Gianclaudio? You're fine. Gianclaudio.
Yeah. No, I think Georgios just very good reply to the question. I would just again build on the difference between data illiteracy and let's say so discrimination within the data process, vulnerability within the data processing and vulnerability to the effect of data processing. I think that people that are vulnerable to the effect of data processing, like migrants, that are also vulnerable in understanding data processed, but also they are vulnerable to the effects, like to the discrimination, etc. They should be, in that case, consent would be really key, right? So I wouldn't like that my anti-consent claim of before is misunderstood. In some cases, consent is a real strong form of agency for people that are in higher risks of discrimination, etc. Right? But I know that biometric data are collected not on consent because it's based on public law. demands, right? Public law duties. So in that case, it's again the question of yours before, right? How we balance public interest with fundamental.
Yeah, if I may just add something. Sorry, Serena, I said I was okay, but then I realized there was a second part of the question on how is AI abusing available citizen data today. And I'd just like to point everyone in this group to very interesting campaign called Reclaim Your Face, started by a number of NGOs and targeting the European Parliament. And the attempt there is to ban facial recognition technology, which is a form of AI, from public spaces across the the European Union. One of the ideas, now we just heard from Gianclaudio that biometric technology is based on public law duties, which is different from the rest in a way. Sorry for cutting the long story short, but just think about, in terms of abuse, think about facial recognition technology for which you're not alerted. So you're not alerted typically to its existence. It's the case, for example, of facial recognition technology in certain cities in the Netherlands. And it's more or less like walking around with your passport pasted open on your forehead, right? So this is the type of data that you give away, besides the rest of the biometrics identification part. So yes, we can imagine that, depends on what you consider as, what you define as abusing. A lot of AI solutions are presented as great, innovative solutions. Like, for example, if you go to the Roma football club stadium in the city of Rome in Italy, there is, the technology, there's been an enormous rollout of facial recognition technology there to allow people to return, to go back to the stadium after COVID or during COVID, given we're still there. So, it depends on what exactly you call like abuse and what you call rights. But I would say that there is, a wide range of different types of abusing of data that we really have to be alerted to. And that's why I mentioned the Reclaim Your Face. I think it is reclaimyourface.eu. That's the URL. They're also collecting signatures. I think it's very important to take action, make our voice heard. If nothing, they might not get to the referendum that they would like to get to, but they eventually at least can change the way, hopefully, raise awareness and change the way we conceive or think of artificial intelligence applications in today's society.
Yeah, thank you. I've put the link in the chat for everyone to check. Someone is writing a question, waiting for this. There is an issue that, Gianclaudio, you were mentioning at one point, the paradox that for vulnerable, very often, and when we think about migrants, going back to Georgios' presentation, there is this paradox that on the one hand, they have a higher protection need of their own data, but on the other hand, they have a higher need to share. And this goes quite a lot in the field of work of investigative journalists and journalism, generally speaking. So it's very difficult to balance these two things. First of all, I think for these people, for them, the vulnerable, but also for us as a journalist, probably it's always quite complicated. So maybe, can you tell us a little bit more about this? And maybe also in the round, we should maybe address now, someone was asking an hour ago, it's horrible, what can we do after Georgios' presentation? So maybe wrapping it up, but Gianclaudio, please.
So I will try to be very, very rapid about the double privacy paradox. It all started from an empirical study I was doing peer review of. Was a study on consumers' expectation of privacy, and they made a study on COVID-19. A study on pandemic and sharing data during pandemic, their health data, etc. And in particular with tracing apps, like you know the story. So basically, it was I found quite interesting that people with chronic diseases, value more their data. Okay. And the way they don't want to share their data, the reason is not personal reason. The other reason, so why they want to share their data is not for having personal benefits, because they have chronic disease and so higher risk of getting COVID, but for altruistic reason. They want the COVID to be out from our modern society. So in that case, I felt, I mean, I don't know how to interpret this, but I felt it was more altruistic in people with chronic disease. Elderly people, so people older, were more egoistic, so wanted to share their data. In this study, yeah, it's a study, there are more, etc. But just to show, they valued more their data for personal reasons. They could share this data, even if they valued a lot their data. So just this to show that there is these different reasons why we share and different reasons why we value our data and we don't want to disclose them. Of course, in some situations you are forced to share, and so that's where the law comes, that's where data protection comes. So I think it's important to have a safeguard here. I see in the chat I have nothing to hide, why I should care. We could reply, I have nothing to say, but is this also a reason to block my freedom of speech? Also this, right? So just this. Okay, I don't know if I replied to your Yeah,
thank you. Maybe one last round. Stefania, do you want to say something on this topic, like the paradox, and also maybe the big question, what can we do or shall we do?
Yeah, maybe I focus on what can we do and what should we do, because I have a believer in the power of literacy, but also the power of storytelling in changing our perspectives on a lot of all of this. So as a matter of fact, these are complex matters. We tend to, enjoy technology, understandably, enjoy freedom of movement, enjoy being together with other people. So we tend to overlook a number of privacy-related, for example, or inequality-related consequences. We also tend to believe that technology has it's surrounded by some sort of magic aura, it's part of also the marketing that all this technology is through which this technology is brought to us. So I do believe, and there's a lot of journalists here today, so I think it falls on you guys to change the terms of the debate and change the stories. I mean, if you look, for example, I focus a lot on the Italian media because, especially since I live abroad, I read paradoxically more those than I did, more of those than when I used to live in my own country. But a lot of the reporting on technology and privacy or whatever, it's pretty banal and pretty market oriented. It's mostly like big spots. And it requires, of course, knowledge to maybe also write with competence about, for example, the risks of AI and whatever. But I do believe that it starts from there. It starts from different reporting. Starts from different attention to, balancing the fun that technology brings about with also the risks without scaring people, which is not very easy to do. And the second aspect that I would like to touch upon is the role of literacy. We tend to, our schools in general prepare the citizens of the future with a number of very important notions like counting, like history, and you name it. But very little attention is given to preparing the digital citizens of the future. And this is an enormous problem that has to be tackled by national governments with national policies and resources, also to empower, of course, teachers to do that. And but that has to change, because that's only through this that we can ask to raise and we can learn to ask and raise critical questions. I guess I'll leave it at that. There's a lot of examples and good experience in that respect, but a lot has to be done.
Georgios, you want to say something for the last round? We are almost over.
Yeah. Yes. So I want to start with, what is the solution to the problem, right? At least in my context, the solution to the problem is like a completely recrafted asylum and migration system in Europe that will not confine people in the south, that will give the opportunity to people to seek their life chances across Europe and not just in the first country where they arrive. Because as long as you have this system in place, as long as you have these rules in place, people will always try to resist to control. They will try to avoid provide their biometric data, or they will be forced to provide their biometric data. So the solution is, I don't think that it is a technological one, but rather a policy one. We need a change in policy. And I just want to say something very briefly about artificial intelligence and how it is used sometimes to European citizens. So there is this system in place which is not so well known. Let's say it is the European passenger name record framework that collects passenger data in order to identify potentially risky travelers, and this targets both EU citizens and third-country nationals. And it is supposed in the future to implement machine learning technologies in order to somehow automatically analyze data. And I have a colleague we write together, and I think he's also called Stefania Rocco-Bellanova, who has written a lot about this kind of stuff. And what I want to say is that sometimes we talk too much about technology, so artificial intelligence, algorithms, and so on, but we tend to forget data. And in those contexts, data quality matters a lot. Because if for example a passenger sends wrong data, or if the data that state authorities collect are of bad quality, then the predictions that are being made through different kinds of algorithmic systems will be wrong, will be discriminating, and so on. So I think that public debates should focus a bit more on data rather than technologies as such, and try to find a solution not only to who shares and who collects data, but also the very materiality of data. So the quality of the data, how do we make sure that the data that are being collected are of good quality, they are not discriminating against specific categories of individuals, that they are not biased, and so on. And I will leave it there.
Okay, so if there are no new questions, which I don't think so, we leave it. We are exactly 90 minutes cut. Thank you so much to our three speakers for being today with us, and thank you for everyone attending.